sleepy seaside town in North Yorkshire, a typical parish church. Inside, the local priest is going through the rituals of an exorcism. For the priest, this is by no means an unusual experience. The service of deliverance, as it's called, is set out in exactly the same way as those for christenings and marriages. Not used as often, perhaps, but it is being called upon more and more frequently as people turn to the church for help in situations they don't understand. For Jane, the young mother involved, it is, however, intensely traumatic. Her life has changed so rapidly. Just 6 months ago, she was perfectly happy, living in a small apartment with her young daughter. Then she began to feel that her life was being invaded by a threatening spirit. Eventually, in her desperation, she turned to her local priest. This is the second exorcism she's been through in a matter of weeks.
Strange things started happening about October last year. First, I must admit, it was a big joke. I mean, with Chloe's toys moving about, friends had come round and, you know, they'd throw a toy through the door and say, "Oh God, you know, it's moving."
I didn't think a lot about what she was saying at first because I thought she'd have to experience a bit more until I could see, until I could understand it, because I couldn't understand, you know. I didn't know whether it was imagination or anything, because I couldn't see anything. And I was willing to watch because I was interested in watching.
The thing that brought it to a head was I'd put all the lights on in the flat while I was going to bed. And I just sat up in bed really thinking I'm going to challenge whatever this thing is. And said, well, if you're there now, I can't, you know, see you because all my lights are on. And if you show yourself, I won't see anything. And with that, my little girl's nightlight flew off the shelf into her cot, just missing her. And the light went out, so I automatically dived out of bed thinking it might have hit Chloe. And as I walked towards the cot, the shelf that the nightlight was on just flipped up, as if this thing was saying, you know, this wasn't an accident, it was, you know, the lights won't bother me.
Finally, I went down to stay with her this particular evening and got in the bed at the side of where she said this person or thing had been touching in the middle of the night. And she said, "It's coming for me now, Mum." And I said, "Well, I can't feel anything," which I didn't. And but I could hear the clicking that she said it was.
This tapping started at the right side near me. And Mum said, "Look, it's your radiator," something like that. Well, the tapping just turned into a great big banging, as if somebody was banging on the kitchen door. And then I just got the icy cold feeling. And I said, "It's here again." But this time when it came, it wasn't just an uncomfortable feeling. It was a feeling of, it wanted to hurt me. Like, it was really as if it had got its hand round my face, squeezing them, you know, squeezing my face.
She said it was on her. She screwed up. She was clawing at her face, pulling her hair and everything. That lasted for a few minutes and went away again. So we rang Reverend Willis, who came down.
Tom Willis is close to retirement. He's been a priest for over 40 years, and he has a strong reputation for the sensitivity and clarity with which he handles paranormal cases. His view of the role of exorcism might be described perhaps as the older, traditional view of the church. Ghosts exist, they can and do interact with living people, and the service of exorcism is designed to drive out the alien spirit when its presence causes fear and dread.
I command in the name of Jesus Christ, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, any evil around you or within you to be bound, and to go from this place, never to return, doing no harm to anyone in the going, through the power and in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, who with the Father and the Holy Spirit reigns supreme over all things, now and forever. Amen. The biggest problem in all this ministry is diagnosis. You know, is it really happening for a start? Is this hysteria? What evidence is there other people have witnessed things? And in this case, certainly a lot of people seem to have witnessed and experienced things happening. Well, where there is a haunting, there is a distortion. It's a kind of spiritual sickness. And therefore our ministry is to bring healing to it and to bring the peace of God back to this place. And therefore to send the soul to that place appointed for it. If it is something evil, to command it to go to that place appointed for it, never to return. The ministry is really freeing people from oppression of some kind.
Tom Willis's first response was to call on Jane and to try to bless her and the flat. But what might have seemed a simple act proved impossible to carry out.
He tried to start blessing me, and I just wouldn't have it. I mean, a lot of the things I don't know what I was doing, but I'd just like pass out, and when I came round I just felt drained of every bit of energy I'd got.
We finally got her out of there, physically, dragging her out up to our home. We spent a restless night at home, at my house, and then we took her to church the next day.
When the attempt at blessing failed, Tom Willis decided to carry out a full exorcism in the church. But once again, whatever it was that was troubling Jane drove her into a violent and uncontrolled reaction.
He tried to give me a card to read. I wouldn't mention the name Jesus. I just could not bring myself to say it. At one point, this thing came, and I was aware. It's the only real thing I can remember. I was aware of Reverend Willis trying to put holy oil on me. And all I was thinking was, get him away, don't let him near me.
They finally laid hands on her and blessed her. And a most terrible noise came from her. I can't explain it really. It was like a scream and a growl, a spitting, snarling. Terrible. That went on for about 20 minutes. And then she just blacked out. When she came round, she was able to repeat this renunciation on the card, what Reverend Willis asked her to do. And we went out of church. And she got colour in her cheeks, but her hair had gone straight.
When this first exorcism failed, Jane found it impossible to continue living in the flat in which up till then she'd been so happy. She simply couldn't overcome her sense of fear and dread.
A friend knew what I was going through, and I had an offer of the flat I'm in now. Because, I mean, perhaps I would have stayed at my mum's longer, but like I'd got all my furniture, I'd got nowhere to put it. And I suppose really I kept saying to myself, you're strong enough to keep going, don't let this thing beat you. About a month ago, I was obviously in bed asleep. The next minute, I got out. I can remember coming out of the bedroom and trying to go into the kitchen for a drink. It was as if something was trying to stop me getting this drink. And I was just literally, what I thought I was falling on the floor. But as I've looked into it, I realise now I tried to get up 2 or 3 times. I mean, I had cuts all over me, bruises. But in the end of that episode, I just literally laid on the floor and curled up. And the only thoughts that were going through my mind was, if I lay here and die, somebody will find Chloe because my front curtains are shut.
When Jane found that the sense of oppression and fear had followed her into her new apartment, she became desperate, and she turned again to the only source of help she knew, Tom Willis. And despite the agonies of her first experience, she agreed to go through a second exorcism service. It is now some weeks since that second exorcism. It was clearly a more controlled and calm event. Jane experienced nothing like the pain and anguish of her first service. But despite that, the deep underlying anxiety remains. A constant fear is that the sense of an alien spirit will return.
The only thing that makes sense is that there seems to be something trying desperately to communicate with her because she's a mother, and trying to draw near to the child and to herself. We've tried to do some research on her original flat, and we understand there was a tragedy connected with the flat where a child died.
There seems to be still something there with Jane because she's still not settled, but it's a different kind of thing. She just senses that there's something around her, but not making her do things she doesn't want to do. It's not making her ill. She can't sleep though at nights. And she is frightened.
The Christian Church has, of course, been dealing with the spirit world ever since its inception. So there's a great body of tradition and experience in this field. But in modern times, the Anglican Church, for example, has re-examined and redefined its position. It is now very much less concerned with driving out evil spirits, much more concerned with psychology and treating the whole person. The modern Anglican clergyman will have been exposed to the latest psychiatric and psychological views to assist him in dealing with paranormal cases.
In the 1960s, the Bishop of Exeter set up a commission of psychiatrists and priests to look at the whole question of ministry of exorcism. And the reason for this was that so many people were turning up on vicarage doorsteps saying that they'd got paranormal activity or they'd been involved in the occult, and the clergy didn't know how to deal with it. And so one of the recommendations of that report, which was put into effect, was that each bishop would appoint people, clergy within his diocese to deal with this particular ministry. And we train them to do it. So when they're sent on a training course, there are psychiatrists and psychologists and clergy with vast experience present so that they can be taught the way to approach these particular problems, and particularly to be taught to look for a natural or a psychological explanation before going for a paranormal one. So we have a problem, I think, of suffering from the Greek sort of understanding of a human being. We divide human beings into body, mind and spirit, with the GP, the psychologist and the priest dealing with the different parts. That wouldn't have been an understanding that Jesus had. I mean, he would have used the Hebraic model, which was to see a person as a whole person. So a person that was a soul, a person didn't possess a soul. And so he could forgive someone's sins and heal their bodies at the same time. And we really need to get back to that sort of ministry.
It all sounds very clear, in theory at least. But how does that highly structured, somewhat academic position stand up to the test of reality, to the kind of problem that more and more people are bringing to their local churchmen? Tom Willis has 2 or 3 cases every month. They're all profoundly different. After seeing Jane, for example, with her deep-seated, deeply personal fears, he is now on his way to another request for help from a woman who believes that her house has been taken over by a spirit.
And this particular case, the local vicar rang up, and a woman in his parish who was reporting something appearing every evening, or most evenings, around about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. Several people have witnessed it and experienced it. A tremendous sense of coldness, the sense of a presence coming into the room and just standing there. And she thinks it's something to do with her aunt. It was when she brought in 2 vases which belonged to her aunt that began the whole thing. She seems a very sensible person from the phone call, and the phenomena seem to be very familiar stuff, really. And I think it will need simply a blessing of the house and praying for the woman who has died.
Well, we just got a message to go and pick up these particular vases from a house in York. I'd never been anywhere near the place or anything, and apparently Carol was telling me a bit of the story about them. She'd seen them when she was a kiddie, and this aunt had said, "They're yours when you grow up, or when I die." So we found the house and went in and had a cup of tea and there's these 3 black plastic bags on the floor, and her auntie there was telling her various stories about what went on, and about, you know, about the old girl that had died and what she'd left and all that.
I had a talk with her sister. She pointed out where the vases were. I put them in the car. Oh. Mr. Waits and myself went to Clifton, to the shops, and I'd left the car outside the pet shop in Clifton. I came out, and it wasn't there.
And where the hell is the car? You know, it was like that. Well, anyway, we found it, and it wasn't where we put it, I'm sure.
We got stuck in a traffic jam. The car overheated. We managed to get out of the traffic jam. I came up to the house. I put the vases and the urn onto the settee. And from there, my troubles began.
Carol had always been very close to her Aunt Alice. Indeed, she'd been virtually brought up by her. They'd always had a strong and loving relationship, until 2 years or so ago, when they had a powerful argument. And the two still hadn't become reconciled when the aunt died. The vases bequeathed in the will were placed on windowsills, on the stairs, and in the bedrooms.
There was a plant in the window ledge, and I said, that plant's moving. The leaves were moving and there was no draft. It was a lovely autumn night, really. And after that it started getting colder. I said, is it going to freeze tonight? All this tingling. No, there isn't a draft. And I actually got on the floor and went checking all around. There's no drafts. The dog was laid against the door. And after about an hour, I said, well, it's getting warmer again now. This is strange. The next night, the same thing happens again. I looked at the clock, and then it got to be a bit of a joke. I used to say to her, hey, up, it's about time for Auntie Alice to come. As a joke. And it got a bit serious then.
The house is, I think, 14-year-old. It's got a parquet. It's got central heating. The heating is always on, and it's a warm house. On a night, anywhere from 8:30 till 10 o'clock at night, it is so icy, so cold, and it starts from the stairs and works its way down.
And it gets to the witching hour sort of thing. Never really sensed anything. No cold as such. And I was just out of my eye corner, sensed something on the stairs to my right. And I thought, well, what's that? I don't look, but I looked through my eye corners at it, and there was this shape, 5 foot, shimmering grey, black. Couldn't really define whether it was a human being or what, but it was stood at the base of the stairs there. And the dogs, previous to this, of course, one dog had been looking up the stairs, as if there was someone up the stairs. And I kept looking and saying, shut up, you know, he was grumbling and panting a little bit. And about an hour after that, Carol said, I've just seen something on the stairs.
And I said to Tony, there's something at the bottom of the stairs. And Tony said, it's been here an hour. And I said, you're joking. And I happened to look to the stairs, and it vanished.
She said, well, what was it then? I said, well, I explained to her what it was, this 5 foot figure of sorts, a shadow, shimmering, not moving, just shimmering. And she said, well, Auntie Alice was only 5 foot something.
I know for a fact she's actually haunting me. For the simple reason is she was taken into hospital, and she always said that she would come back and haunt. And little did I know, she's actually haunting me.
Carol is a person with an immensely strong and stable personality. But as her sense of unease deepened, she began to look around for help. Her local vicar referred the case to Tom Willis.
Well, the service we do here, the blessing of a house, is a traditional one in which we start at the front door and pray that the peace of God may return to this house, assuming that there is a disturbance or there are memories and possibly hauntings connected with this house. And it's blessing all four walls of each room with holy water. In some sense, you get memories hanging around objects, it would seem, and therefore it's sometimes important to bless the actual object around which is the centre of attention, to specifically command that the peace of God may remove the disturbance which seems to, or the memory that seems to hang around that particular object. The problem is we don't really know if we believe it is her aunt hanging around, why she's hanging around. Is it that she's trying to force her into a course of action? She's saying, she's still trying to dominate the family. Well, I hope after blessing the house that Carol will report that there is a warmth in the house, which was not there before. That there's a sense of peace about the place, and that objectively that the soul of Alice has gone in peace and will bother them no more.
It does seem that despite many hundreds of years of experience, the church certainly doesn't have all the answers as far as the paranormal is concerned. Indeed, it's rather difficult to reconcile the cases of people like Jane and Carol with the somewhat sterile official position. And what of Jane and Carol? How have their lives been changed by the religious intervention? For Carol, it hasn't improved matters. Whatever is troubling our house seems to have become more noisy and boisterous. There are now bangings and rumblings and heavy footsteps on the stairs. For Jane, for a while after the second exorcism, things got much worse. Eventually Tom Willis called in a psychic medium, and they claimed they made contact with the spirit of a young girl who had died tragically in the area 100 years ago, in 1897. They established from local records that had indeed happened. The night following that encounter, Jane suddenly felt the oppression lift from her. It hasn't returned.
Stories of ghosts or hauntings, spirits from another world, call them what you will, tend to be associated with the emotions of fear and dread. Perhaps that's inevitable, but it's by no means always the case. In this programme, we look at the other end of the spectrum. 2 stories of hauntings that seem to arise as a result not of pain, but of pleasure. The intense emotional attachment to a place where there has been great happiness.
I never ever believed in ghosts. In fact, I used to scoff at people who did. I used to think that, it's odd. I just can't understand it at all. No such thing. And it took a lot for me to understand, how and why it happens. But now I wouldn't scoff at anyone because it does happen.
Well, it's just the fact that I cannot disregard what has happened, what I've heard and what I have seen. So now I can only believe that there must be something other than we humans.
Just before Miss Macpherson retired, she said to me, "You know, Rita, I will never ever leave this place." And I don't think she ever will. And I hope she never does.
This story of love from beyond the grave comes from the city of York. This church is right in the heart of the city. And in the church hall here, Mary Macpherson, known to everybody as Mary Mac, ran a very happy, very popular school of ballroom dancing.
Miss Macpherson was a very strong personality, very strong character. Brilliant dancer, brilliant technician, a wonderful lady in general. Had her idiosyncrasies, but at the same time I had a great admiration for her work and her as a person. She was very direct, very, very forthright, strong, but immaculate in appearance. Never ever saw with her hair out of place. Her clothes were always of very expensive tastes.
Rita and Dennis Cole had been persuaded by Mary to take over the running of the school, and it may be she had some prescience, because within a year she died of a brain tumour. But it seems she was determined to keep her word, never to leave the place, because immediately after her death, strange things began to happen.
I started dancing I took over the studio in 1964, and slightly after that, when I started hearing sounds after Miss Macpherson died, and I heard the counting of the coins first. I was waiting for a pupil to arrive, and all of a sudden I heard this noise with heavy coinage being banged onto the desk, counted up and banged onto the desk. And I walked across the room. The nearer I got to the desk, the louder the sound became. But when I reached the desk, it stopped. So I walked back and it started again. And so I didn't tell anyone about this. I kept it very much to myself. And then my mother, she came down one day and she had the same experience. And she came home and rather looking aghast. I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I was at the studio." And she said, "And I heard this strange noise." I said, "Yes, was it a counting of money?" She said, "Yes, it was." And banged into piles. She said, "Yes." So she said, "You've also heard it?" I said, "Yes, I have." She said, "You never told anyone?" I said, "No, I didn't tell anyone. I think I was crazy."
One evening when we were teaching, footsteps came up the corridor, came into the cloakroom, and the couple I was taking, we were waiting for them coming in, whoever it was coming into the hall. And the gentleman I was taking, of the couple I was taking, said, "Oh, I think she must be shy." And I went into the cloakroom to see this female because it was the sound of high heels. And of course there was just no one there. I couldn't disregard that, and nor could the couples that were in with us at the time.
We started hearing footsteps coming down the corridor, and then we'd hear the door open, and we have a metal coat rail, and we'd hear the hangers being taken off and replaced, and we'd go and see who it was. There was never anyone there. We went out into the street to see if it was the feet were outside and getting the kind of echo coming up the corridor, but we didn't. There's just no one there at all. We had two young ladies, very, very young ladies, early teens, about 12, 13. And one evening they came to me for a drink. They wanted a squash or a Coke. So I served them with it, gave them the change. They went to sit down to drink their Coke and had a sip out of the Coke. My husband said to them, "Now it's time you two got up and had a dance, you see." So they put the drinks down and they put the change that I'd given them down, and they got up to dance, and all of a sudden the change flew up into the air, landed onto the floor, and Sally Ann, she was a lovely little girl, always brushing her hair, so a hairbrush always was with her, and a hairbrush shot up and under the chair too. So they came howling into the kitchen to me and said, "Oh, Rita." And they told me what had happened, you see. So I said, "Well, are you frightened of the money?" So we don't want it. I said, well, I'll change it for you. I'll give you another 10 pence each. So I did. I swapped it over for them. But nothing I could do about the hairbrush. So she took it to church the next morning and had it blessed.
So extraordinary things have happened in the church hall. But how do we know that it's Mary Mack who is responsible? Well, there have been a number of sightings of the old lady going about her business. And remarkably, whenever that has happened, people have smelt Mary Mack's perfume, the scent of carnations, around the place.
A lady, one evening, I had her for a lesson, and then she used to come back to a class afterwards. And she came back to her class and she said, who was the old lady you had, Rita, for a lesson after me? I said, no lady. I said, I didn't have an old lady after you. She said, you did. I passed her in the corridor and she gave me a very funny look. I said, no, I'm sorry, it's my coffee break. I didn't have anyone. So I said, describe this lady to me, please. So she says, she's a smallish lady, very smart, very immaculate. She had kind of a bluish rinse on her hair, and she had a creamy, fluffy blouse and a navy blue suit on. Are you sure you didn't see her? I'm positive. I said, if I were to show you a picture, a group picture, could you pick that lady out for me? Now, this girl, she was a stranger to York. She'd come to work in York with the bank, and this was years after Miss Macpherson had died. So I produced a photograph which was taken in London at Grosvenor House. And the girl immediately went to the lady who had the dancing school before me, which was Miss Macpherson.
Eventually, the story of the haunted ballroom reached the ears of John Mitchell, who was then researching a book on the ghosts of York. John is a highly experienced paranormal investigator.
I think that this is one of the most remarkable cases that was collected because of the characters of the witnesses. I have known them now for over 20 years. They've never altered their story. They had nothing to gain and a great deal to lose if they came out into the public eye. And I just believe in them.
So what is happening in the church hall at St Mary's? It does seem that Mary Macpherson loved the place and her life here so much that in some strange way she has maintained a connection with it. Some element of her personality, down to the detail of the perfume she used, seems to have survived her death.
There is certainly a personality after death. What form of life it is, I don't know. Obviously, if we accept the story of the couple going out and being able to describe Mary Mack, what she was wearing, and the scent of carnations, then obviously Mary Mack is still wearing the sort of clothes that she was wearing when she was part of the school in the physical life.
The question of consciousness is still a very murky area, but our general understanding is that our consciousness, our vital sense of self, resides within our brains, and when the brain dies, so does our consciousness. But many mainstream scientists are now asking whether that can possibly be the whole story, since there are so many cases where, despite the absence of the working brain, so to speak, through anesthetics, for example, the mind still continues to operate. This raises the distinct possibility that even after the dissolution of the brain, in death, some part of our personality could go on functioning.
I think there is massive evidence for the continuation of consciousness after the dissolution of the particular gubbins we happen to be lodged in for the time being in this three-dimensional place. I can't say that I'm utterly convinced. I think different interpretations could be placed on the material which has come through, but there's a pretty strong indication that we do continue. Consciousness continues, personality continues. If I had to bet on it, I'd bet on it. I'd give it odds.
The assumption that scientists usually make is that the mind is just the brain. On the other hand, I feel the evidence from psychical research suggests that while it is certainly influenced by the brain, it is something more than the brain. For example, experiments where people appear to be able to view what's going on at a distance as if they were there, rather suggests that the mind has some extension and part of it at any rate can travel about. So the brain may just be some kind of computer that the mind can use.
The old science is breaking down at the edges. The evidence is accumulating that you have now to take into account the fact that mind can act outside the brain. And that then opens this whole question of entities going on after death, of there being some imprint on this world caused by people who have lived. And we just have to take these questions now as real scientific questions and generate the appropriate theories to explain them.
And I think if it is Miss Macpherson, she's keeping a very friendly eye on the place. She's not a frightening character. She seems rather benevolent. I think she just likes to look in occasionally and see that all is going well. But of course she had to make herself known somehow. So perhaps the rattling of the coat hangers, the counting of the money, obviously a Yorkshire ghost if she's interested in her money still, were her way of drawing attention to herself.
Miss Macpherson loved the dancing world. She loved it, and I don't think she ever wants to go away from us. She's happy with the people. She's happy just circulating. I'm sure that's it.
Just across the Pennines from the city of York is the equally historic city of Lancaster. In the centre of Lancaster is the Grand Theatre, one of the oldest theatres in the country. It goes back to the end of the 18th century, and it has a very long history of paranormal activity. In her prime, the great actress Sarah Siddons played here. Tonight, the star billing goes to Al Jolson.
California, here I come, right back where I started from. Where flowers bloom in the spring. Each morning at dawning, where singing everything. The sun kissed misted, don't be late. That's why I can hardly wait. Open up the golden gate, California, here I come.
Here at the Grand in Lancaster, which is over 200 years old now, I had a strange feeling. I mean, obviously there are ghosts in this. There's got to be ghosts in a theatre that old. But I had a strange feeling when I was doing the Jaws. I just felt like a cold shiver, as if someone walked over my grave, sort of thing. And I don't know. I just felt that there was something there at that particular moment. And if it's the ghost of the theatre, I might be arguing with Al Jolson. I could see a fight like that.
The experience described by Al Jolson, or Steve Keane to give him his real name, is by no means uncommon. Over the years, many members of the audience, as well as players on the stage, have described unusual, inexplicable experiences. Many of them, strangely, talk of apparitions that seem to float in the air, well above the existing floor level. At first hearing, that seems to make them stranger than ever, but as it happens, there is a very practical explanation.
The old building is different to what it is now. The pit floor was at a higher level, and of course the circle, you had the Georgian type boxes along the sides and the back. So of course, if there was anybody haunting, you might say, then they would be walking along the old level.
The time that I think that I had an experience was when I was working on a costume play, and in order to see the effect as it was on the stage, I walked through the auditorium to about halfway up the aisle and turned round and saw a lady, indeterminate age, who was walking between me and the stage. And I said, "What are you doing there?" And at that moment, she's faded. It wasn't like a puff of smoke. She faded like an old photographs fade until there was nothing there. And I found it very upsetting. I have not spoken to anybody about it except one member of the Footlights. We were doing the Taming of the Shrew at the time, and this lady was certainly dressed in a period-type costume, but of the wrong period. And this is why she struck me as being in the way, and I was annoyed, and my tone must have been very annoyed. There was one other thing. I later realized that, in fact, she wasn't walking on the floor. She was neither at the height of the stage nor at the height of the auditorium. It was somewhere in between. But I was concentrating on the costume rather than anything else.
Melanie Warren is a very well-known paranormal investigator. She's taken a great interest in the goings-on at the Grand.
Tozer's evidence impressed me because it matches several other stories that I've heard. In the 1950s, Pat Phoenix, who was an actress, was working here. She saw a similar person, and the lady disappeared in much the same way that Tozer described. And also Amira Jackson, who saw a lady on the stage. It seems to be the same woman that everyone's seeing. I think Tozer's testimony impresses me because she's such a strong lady in herself, you know, and she really is not keen on talking about the experience that she had. She only came on the programme and talked about it because she was convinced that she saw something, even though she can't explain it.
I have personally never had any experience of ghosts. I can't say that I believe in ghosts. I know that this was something that I may have imagined because it was so fleeting. But no, I'm not that sort of person. I'm extremely realistic, really.
As we've mentioned, in her heyday, the famous 18th century actress Sarah Siddons played at the Grand. She came to Lancaster at least partly because her brother-in-law ran the theatre. Legend has it that her spirit remains to haunt the place. We called in a very experienced psychic medium, Joan Norton, to see if she could establish contact with anything that might be historically verified. We gave her no warning of where she was going.
But I feel particularly drawn to the behind me, to the that corner of there, strong vibrations. Over here, different feeling again. I feel as though something's coming down on me here, as though something's...
Well, Joan didn't make contact with Sarah Siddons, but there seemed to be some connection with the theatre's distant history.
She's come up with a few bits of evidence which do fit the facts. She mentioned, for example, that she got a feeling of a fire here. Now, this entire theatre, the interior of it, was completely destroyed, and much of the roof went as well, when there was a fire at the end of the last century, and the place has been completely rebuilt. She also said she felt that there was something below the theatre, downstairs. She wasn't to know that in its original form there were actually dwelling houses underneath the theatre. She also said that her strongest feeling was on the left side of the stage.
The names very significantly attached to the theatre are Walter and Alexander.
She came up with one name, Walter, and a very brief look through the history has shown that there was a Walter. She said that Walter was connected with the running of the building. There was a Walter. Edmund Sharp took over the building in 1843. He worked wonders for the building. He died in 1877, and he passed on the building to his two sons and another gentleman called Walter. This was in 1877. Again, it's the Victorian era we're looking at. All the evidence that's coming in seems to suggest that whatever is going on here dates from the Victorian era.
Theatres, of course, everywhere have a long tradition of connection with the paranormal. The life of these buildings is suffused with emotion and passion and high drama as the actors strut and fret their lives upon the stage. It isn't difficult to believe that here, if anywhere, the very fabric of the building absorbs some of the emotion that is expended down the years. It is classical stone tape theory.
This is a theatre. Emotion is high. I reckon a lot of it must dissipate into the vastness behind you. So,
one theory of haunts is one which may be called, for want of a better phrase, the stone tape theory, where you have to postulate that in the case of a typical haunt, some very emotion-laden scene or some very important scene from the point of view of the humans who took part in it, has somehow become registered on the environment, not necessarily within a house, maybe even outside. And that it's almost like a sort of psychic video that has been created. And someone who comes along who is sensitive enough to act as a psychic video player will actually play that tape and see the figures, or perhaps even hear voices, or hear sounds. And it is nothing to do with the people who originally were there. They're no longer there. It's simply a record.
I'm not convinced that ghosts are the spirits of dead people. I tend to think that they're more likely to be recordings on the atmosphere or emotions trapped in the fabric of the building. It's a very difficult theory to explain, but that's the simplest we can come to it.
Often happens after we've done a costume play or we're reenacting something in period, that the appearances get intensified.
Where bowers of flowers bloom in the spring. Each morning.
Well, our Joseph could scarcely be described as costume drama, perhaps. But it isn't hard to imagine the ringing tones of this old Tin Pan Alley number seeping into the bricks and mortar and adding yet another layer to the emotional fabric of the grand old theatre.
Open up that Golden Gate, California, here I